I think the question was, how would we get around House Bill 2439 that was passed in 2019 that prohibited cities from having certain building material standards? Is that right?
Not a liar.
Uh,
So maybe several of you could take facilitate it.
well, that-
Can we do that, Robin?
I'm sorry?
Since it's such a long line, could each of you take a question?
Sure. Do you want to finish the one question? So,
I have to look at the bill and I'll answer the question.
I think what Monty is saying, he'd have to look at the bill in order to answer your question. Doing research on the fly is pretty difficult. And we'd have to look not only at that particular bill as it was enacted, but also the deed restrictions and the applicability as far as it applies to deed restrictions as opposed to ordinances. Again, that is a major difference between the municipalities that exist now, with the exception of maybe a handful of cities within the state, Houston being one of them. Very few have done deed restriction enforcement. And so there may be some provisions whereby it wouldn't, depending on how it's written, it may not be directly applicable because we would have, assuming the city council chose deed restriction over zoning. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm aware of the bill, but it applies to cities implementing regulations, building regulations, as opposed to enforcing deed restrictions. Okay. Okay, I will. Okay, so.
Okay.
Transition agreements, when would those be put in place and how would they work?
Transition
So you have to speak into
agreement.
the microphone for it to be recorded.
City transition agreement?
Hey, you have to talk into the microphone.
Well,
Because it's being
are you
recorded.
familiar with transition agreements? Is that
A governing structure.
Okay, the only transition agreement that I'm aware of that we have is the law enforcement interlocal agreement. We don't have other, quote, transition agreements other than the comprehensive, we have a comprehensive community services agreement, which is transition between us and the development company, which is not affected by incorporation. And had to do with how the Woodlands would be developed out. But the only transition agreement that I'm aware of that we have is for purposes of law enforcement. Now, if the voters choose to incorporate, there would be ordinances passed that would provide for interlocals, perhaps with other governing bodies, for plat review and those sorts of things. But the only transition agreement I'm aware of is the law enforcement agreement. Okay?
written down answer?
Okay. So, could I get some of these cards over here? And
Do you know who would control redevelopment decisions of the mall, if it's a township or if it's a city? So if the mall goes from, who makes a decision about what happens on that property, if it's a city versus it's a township? Right now, it's the developer that would make those decisions. If you're a city,
correct. And as the city would be. Okay.
Gotta have it out.
Okay.
So who gets to control the redevelopment?
she's going to answer.
Cities typically control redevelopment.
That's what I would think. The
Yes,
township
no,
has
correct.
no ability. Is that correct?
The township, as far as who will control redevelopment decisions on malls, would be an area under the new city. The city would have authority, but the township does not.
Correct. And currently the authority lies with the county.
currently Development Authority actually relies on, we're in the ETJ for 2 cities. So Redevelopment Authority to some extent relies on some county authority, but also on the, remember Mitchell Island? That's all ETJ, that's all city redevelopment controlled because it's within their ETJ.
Even though we have this agreement, they still are enforcing rules within their ETJ.
Because the agreement has to do with annexation, it doesn't have to do with plat review and development review. We don't have that authority as a special purpose district. Okay, so that's.
Did anybody ask about the Woodlands Parkway extension and who's going to have control over all that? That's a big concern to a lot of people.
So,
242.
No, that's the Woodlands Parkway.
so your question is who would have control over the Woodlands Parkway extension?
Yes. Thank you. And we don't want any more extra lanes on that parkway.
Okay. The answer on the Woodlands Parkway, when you say extension, that depends on whether or not it's in the new city's boundaries. All right, so what is the roads and streets that are right now within the township boundaries are not the township's roads and streets. They belong to the county, and the county has a responsibility to maintain, repair, police those roadways. But if the voters approve incorporation by law, by state law, the roads, the right-of-way, the authority for the streets and roadways would become that of the new city. The city would then have control over expansion plans within their boundaries.
And that would be up for a vote, right? They'd have to vote on things like that. The residents.
The residents wouldn't vote on, the new city would have authority over roads and streets within their boundaries. So that's what you would be giving the new city council the authority to control. Most cities, when they do road improvements, in fact, by way of example, I used to live in College Station, and I just received a letter because we had property there for a long time. Just received a letter, and they were sending out information to the residents announcing what they called a traffic calming plan to make traffic slow down on a particular roadway. And they were going to have an informational meeting at City Hall. They reached out to the residents so that the residents could be informed. And they would take the feedback of the residents as to whether or not this was something that they wanted, these suggestions. But you wouldn't necessarily, no, you don't vote on every roadway expansion and improvement. There would be hearings, public hearings within the boundaries, but you wouldn't be voting on, but I'm not aware of anybody currently that's on the township board that's in favor of the Woodlands Parkway expansion. And the board that is on today will be the new provisional form of government for if the voters choose to incorporate for the first 6 months. And then thereafter, the voters would elect the replacement governing body. But the county wouldn't be able to come in and say, we're going to expand the parkway. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I have a question for you. So right now, the infrastructure, like the drainage and stuff like that, I thought we controlled that, but apparently we don't control it today.
Okay. So
Because we have better infrastructure than you see in Conroe. So I'm wondering, is it the township already doing?
While she's writing down my answers, I'm just going to answer some of these.
okay, so your question is who has control over the infrastructure currently within the township? the control over the infrastructure within the township as far as drainage. We have some drainage authority within the enabling legislation, but we don't exercise it because there are a number of other entities, governmental entities, already within the boundaries that control drainage. San Jacinto River Authority, the Woodlands, Woodlands Water, all of the various MUDs. There are just there's a great number of entities, governmental entities, that are responsible for drainage. So since there's a case law that indicates even if we have some authority, we would not be supplanting other governmental entities that are already providing those resources. There's not a mechanism for us to do that. The cities, municipalities, have more control over what happens within their boundaries than a special purpose district as far as other governmental entities. So, for example, if we were already incorporated and a MUD came in and wanted to locate within the city boundaries, they have to ask permission. And it's up to the council whether or not they allow that.
If it's a city, right?
If it's a city. And that's why a city can have authority, exercise authority over MUDs if the voters approve incorporation.
So the current model, like you said, there's different entities that are involved in it. We don't control it, but I guess our township is advocating without getting it done, but we don't really have.
What the task force currently does as far as the drainage task force is they coordinate, they try to enhance the communication between those different governmental, it's an informal task force that people are allowed to participate in through invitation, and they can choose whether or not they want to participate, but it's more to foster communication between the local governments and facilitate interlocal agreements.
When it's a home rule charter committee, they can decide
so that they're not
how
at cross
many people they want
purposes
on
and
the
they're
city
talking
council
to
and
each
put
other.
that for part of the home rule decision.
That's correct.
But
We are
under-
an influencer.
They incorporate
That's
as a
entirely
general
correct.
law city
Does
that
help?
is prescribed
Okay.
by state law.
All right.
So there'll be a transition where you could add more if you wanted to, or have fewer. Yes.
And my second question is about why wouldn't we pay the city leaders? It just kind of feels like down the road
Elected
that could be a
officials?
problem.
You know, I mean, I work with cities with council manager form of government. So unlike Houston that has strong mayor, but council manager form of government, it's still pretty unusual for city council members to be paid or be full time, especially in communities of this size. Those are certainly things that communities make decisions on, and they can say, no, we want to pay people, or we want to pay them a stipend. And I've seen all different variations. But typically, kind of the pure council manager form of government has uncompensated elected officials. So it's kind of the traditional reform movement of government and how they set that up.
You did. It got picked up.
Okay, thank you.
There.
You're welcome.
I did it for several tables. I'm trying to get there. Ask a question. But I think mine is just going to be one of those things.
I think that's correct. Can I jump in and answer?
Yeah.
Okay, one of the questions that was asked was, do the sales tax payments to the City of Houston and City of Conroe continue after incorporation? And the answer to that is yes, based on the existing agreements.
I can hardly hear you.
Is he getting it on the there?
All of these are being recorded, and you will be able to watch them from home. But you may have to come around and over here a little closer.
Okay, I'll give you this also. I don't have to write down my answers. We already answered it.
What changes for residents if the vote on 11/2/21 is a no vote? The township continues to do the business that it currently, services that it currently provides, and nothing changes. If we incorporate, can we stop all the developing and clear cutting and tree clear cutting by voting? The new city would have the ability to pass an ordinance that could impact the removal of trees.
So who pays for the consultants and where is Novak from? So the township, we went through a competitive bid process with the township, and so that's who our contract is with. Novak Consulting was headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. We're now owned by Raftellus, which is headquartered in Charlotte. We have offices in 17 states, including one in Austin.
Can I ask another question of you about the replatting? Or are you busy?
No. I was going to.
How does, we were talking about the mall.
If we vote not to incorporate this election, can it be brought up again for a vote in the future? Yes.
Does that also affect our neighborhood shopping centers? The city, these little neighborhood shopping areas?
So,
If the developer decided to sell that to somebody who wanted to change the use of it, that would be controlled by a department in the city of Houston.
it's there. I'm going to write this down and then I'm going to give it to them and then they'll answer. So,
It's just this whole question of redevelopment.
right.
What would be in control?
So this question is the city of the Woodlands bound by the township's 5-year plan as proposed? Obviously a new city council would be able to make decisions about service delivery. The maximum tax rate, however, would be established in this vote, and that creates the boundaries or the operating framework and the revenue sources that the new city would have to work with. So that would be a constraining thing. A home rule charter, home rule decisions could be placed to the voters in future years if you're a city.
Some authority over redevelopment.
Yes. Yeah, the township board would go away and a city council would be formed, first as a general law city and then later as a home rule city where you all decide what the parameters are for how the government will operate. So you would still vote. Go ahead, Karen. You still vote.
Right. So the first election of a city council, if it were approved on the ballot in November, the first city council must be elected no later than the next regular election. So it would be in May. And then as soon as a charter is ready, it could be presented to the voters for consideration, but there is a process to develop that charter. And it largely depends on how quickly everyone on the charter committee can come to an agreement on what to put forward. So it could be 6 months as soon as the next regular election, or it could be longer. It really depends on how long that process takes.
But we have
Which one?
which I was was a replat, but design standards committee, development standards committee, and require the standards that we put in.
We can't answer the why, but the question is who on the board wants to put the question on the ballot. I believe it was a 5-2 vote. I know Dr. Snyder and John Anthony Brown are the two that voted against putting it on the ballot. And I don't have any reason why for or not. But
As I understand it,
was there a meeting? Yeah. Good.
that's my understanding.
The board began the study in 2018 following a number of events in the community. There were concerns over road expansion, flooding, and there was an interest in it, at least studying it. The study was placed on hold. The study came back off of hold, and the board decided that that it was time for the voters to make the decision instead of the board to make the decision.
About that lot. So can we include that somehow? You don't need to answer it. I just thought for them to address it later, the questions and answers. Yeah, you don't need to answer for me right now.
Okay. A question we received: if we incorporate, would Gordy Bunch be mayor? So what happens initially is that the township board serves as an interim city council, and then in no later than May, which is the next regular general election, the entire city council would be elected. So it would be up to the voters from there. In May, you would be able to vote for the city council. Whereas the township is kind of a holder, so they serve as the interim with the chairman in the same structure that they have right now. And then in May, you get to in May, there would be an election, and the voters would get to decide. I mean, we don't know who would run it. No, he does not operate. Well, it's general law. So
Well,
it's in accordance
yeah,
with
I do
what's
that.
in general law.
I get
But
it.
you would have to run for the specific Right. The charter that was discussed, which is that where the residents get to decide how to, that is actually the second step. We are required to incorporate as a general law. Well, the other thing, after that, the citizens write a charter, and it's kind of a two-step process. That part actually initially was sub-ordinances. The nuisance ordinances that we discussed, those can actually be done by the first city council.
I'm going to take all of these with me and go there. Good? All right.
We're not a queue.
All right.